So today I am talking about the Yuan dynasty and looking at patronage issues in the Yuan dynasty. I've been working, as Anne said recently, on the modernist painter Zhao Qi, and we have an exhibition coming up in New York in September. So if you're there, go see it at the Asia Society Museum. He's a fabulous artist, endlessly fascinating, and it was my first foray into something that wasn't very ancient. So I've been working on that. I had to dust off a few of my brain cells to reacquaint myself with the Yuan dynasty, which, as probably most of you know, is a really fascinating time in China. When I was studying, the story of the Yuan was the Mongols conquered China and the Chinese were downtrodden and went into seclusion, and there was a lot of discrimination. Now, those of you who saw the show The World of Kublai Khan at the Metropolitan Museum a few years ago probably know that there's a newer view of the Yuan, which is it's a period of great dynamism, a period when many things were introduced into Chinese culture that then became standard in the subsequent periods, especially of the Ming. Is this okay? And so today what we're going to look at is patronage issues in the Yuan dynasty, keeping in mind this sort of new view and also contrasting it a little bit with that old view of the downtrodden Chinese under the thumb of this conquest dynasty, which of course is partially true. It's just only part of the story, not the full story. So let me start with a slide. I'm going to give some general opening remarks about the history of the Yuan, probably be a review for all of you, but just to position us. And then a few images to talk about some general issues. And then I'm going to talk about 4 aspects of patronage in the Yuan. What I've tried to do was draw as much from the collections here at the Asian Art Museum. And so what you'll see are some considerations of what the conditions for the creation and the paying of those articles was. I tried to also bring some of the things that are currently on view. So those of you who are docents and are taking people through the galleries, you might enjoy seeing those things. Okay, so as I'm sure most of you know, this is mine. The Mongols came from this region up here north of China, and in the late 12th and early 13th century, Genghis Khan, this very powerful military man, consolidated the tribes and began to extend his territory outward from that area. And ultimately, he extended his, this one here, the blue line, is the extent of his empire at the end of his rule in 1227. So from this small central area, moving out, they conquered the northern Chinese territory that was at that time under another foreign dynasty, the Jurchen Jin, which was defeated in 1234. That was after Genghis Khan. And then under his successors, the territory was consolidated, eventually divided into several different khanates, which were independent. The Khan, or the king of the part over here that included the native territories of the Mongols, was called the Great, the Empire, the Great Khan, and he was nominally the Khan of Khans. But what we find in the Yuan is and then eventually, in 1276, under Kublai Khan, the consolidation of most of the territory that we consider China down here and Korea, but did not get to Japan. Well, tried to get to Japan, and those are very famous failed battles, and the Japanese justly take great pride in those defeats of the Mongol armies. The Mongol armies at that point were mainly made up of Koreans, who were drafted into service. So although when we talk about the Mongol Empire, then we're not talking about a lot of Mongolians, okay? The number of native Mongolians in this huge empire was really not that large. And the Mongols ruled through through a system of using the local people and the local customs. They were a fearsome army. Whenever they approached a town that they wanted to conquer, they would send an advance detachment out to say, please sue for peace. If you do, you will be rewarded richly, and you will become part of our domain, which is glorious, and please do this. And towns that didn't then were really ransacked and destroyed. So this kind of legacy of their military might preceded them as they moved across these vast territories. And the subjects in these conquered areas who had actually pledged allegiance to the Mongols were greatly favored. And so they became, especially those of the local elites, became the new ruling class. And so they ruled through local elites who had become allegiant to the new system. Now, as you can see, this huge extent of the territory meant that there was this new kind of what we would call an international spirit, okay? People, things moved across and around this environment quite freely. And so the Yuan is a period, although it's, when we say Yuan, we really mean this part of the Mongol Empire in China, not all of this. But it was a period sometimes referred to as Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol period of Mongol peace, although there were still warring factions. But it ushered in an age of great dynamic trade and movement of people, ideas, things across all of these borders. The Mongol at the center, and at the center of each of the capitals, were reveled in their power, and they were quite the lovers of valuable things, particularly gold and jewels and silver. And so a lot of the work that was created at the center was, of the centers of these kingdoms, was very luxurious, exceedingly well worked. One of the things that they did when they conquered a territory would be to round up all the artisans, especially the textile workers, but also the silversmiths and goldsmiths and other painters, architects, master woodworkers, and bring them to their capitals. And there they would create large workshops full of all of these people. Now, if you bring all of those people from all these differing areas and you centralize them, what you get is a really dynamic arts community, right? Where there's lots of overlap, where people are bringing new visual vocabularies, or what they don't recognize as new, but other people are seeing as new. So you get this kind of engine of great creativity and in these workshops where people are brought together. Okay, so let's move forward. So this is in the Asians collection. I did not see it on view. Has it been on view recently? No? Oh, okay, it's a beautiful, I actually haven't seen it in the flesh, but it's a beautiful painting attributed to Rembo Wen, who lived in the middle of the 14th century. And it shows horses and other kinds of tribute being brought to the emperor. So they walk toward you. You all know that you read the scroll from here to here. So as you're opening the scroll, you're faced with this person coming to offer tribute. This was an old topic that goes way back into the 6 dynasties in Chinese painting, of people from afar bringing things in tribute to the central court. Again, there's a kind of political overtone to this. Although we don't know the exact circumstances under which this painting was created, one story is it purports to be a copy of a Tang Dynasty painting, but there are various aspects in some of the iconography and in the clothing that are definitely not Tang, and so it's not a faithful copy. If it is a copy, it's an up-to-date copy. There was another episode in which the Catholic Church in France sent to the Mongol court in what was Beijing. Let me go back. The capital was here in Beijing. The first time, it was called Dadu. It's the first time that Beijing became the capital of all of this territory. Okay, so one of the stories that we have from the imperial history of the Yuan is that in 1332, I think it is, this group of Franciscans brought two beautiful horses in tribute to the Mongol emperor. And that he, in Dadu, and that he ordered the court artist to make a picture of this. So this may be actually a record of that event. In any case, it is in a kind of archaic Chinese style. Tribute paintings usually have individual figures of various racial characteristics and ethnic characteristics, notably distinguished by their different kinds of clothing styles, against a blank background, proceeding towards the viewer, okay, bringing the gifts towards the viewer. And we'll look at this in a little while in the context of horse painting in the Yuan dynasty and the kinds of patronage context. I bring it here just as an introduction to give you a sense of the breadth of this dynamic empire, the sort of trade, gifts being passed around, and the way in which this dynamic artistic culture is developing in the Yuan dynasty. Here we see another one of these tribute paintings. This is by a very famous artist, Mongkoo, who I'll talk about in a little while. He was a scion of the defeated Song dynasty imperial family. He was descended from one of the Song emperors. And he eventually went to work for Kublai Khan in the Yuan capital. And under one of Kublai Khan's successor, he was ordered to paint an image of auspicious grain. So an image that suggests the growing Mongol appreciation not of nomadic culture, not of fine craftsmanship, but rather the agricultural culture that undergirded the Chinese territory's economy, in which they increasingly appreciated, the Mongols increasingly appreciated and tried to take advantage of. The other thing is that this scion of the previous Chinese dynasty was very much a Confucian scholar, very literate, educated, and well respected by his peers. And this shows us the Mongol interest in bringing local elites into the ruling polity. And so increasingly what we'll see over the Yuan is, regardless of their unhappiness in being in a conquest dynasty, an increasing acknowledgement that they could actually serve the Chinese population by being at the center, okay? So rather than absenting themselves from this new government, actually participating. And we see developing across the Yuan, actually very early in Kublai's reign, a tension in the ruling family between becoming more Chinese-like, more Confucian. The emperors and the imperial scions learned Chinese, were literate, could read and write. They sponsored debates at court between different Chinese beliefs, so between Confucians and Buddhists and between Taoists and so forth and so on. They instituted a lecture mat, a kind of situation where the emperor would bring noted Confucian scholars from throughout the empire into his court and have them lecture him about various things. Some of the emperors became avid collectors of ancient Chinese painting and had private libraries full of Chinese books in which they viewed these works. Especially Tug Timur, who reigned in 1328 to 1332, was noted for this. But there were other members of the Mongol elite that were also quite enamored with Chinese culture, Chinese literature, Chinese ideas of rulership. I show you two portraits of Kublai Khan and his wife, Chabi. He's dressed rather plainly, but she's got on this beautiful brocaded cloth that's called the cloth of gold, which was a symbol of Mongol power, and we'll look at that in a little while. An important thing to note is that these were made to be installed in a shrine, and that there was a kind of equal treatment of women. Some of the Korean kings were married to Mongol princesses, and if you go to Korea and you see their tombs, you will see that, which are in Kaesong, I think, Kaesong. They actually are exactly the same size, okay? So it wasn't, they're dual tombs, one for the wife, one for the husband, and they're exactly the same size. So it's sort of a greater acknowledgement of the role of women in Mongol society, especially at the ruling elite. Okay, so increasing interest in Chinese culture by Mongol elites, at the same time a sense that they were losing their identity, okay? What it meant to be Mongol, okay? That steppe culture. Here they were in this large, elegant city, on the northern edge of Chinese culture, but certainly in touch with much of southern culture. And so they would retire, they would take long trips up into the steppe and take large hunting trips, okay? So the celebration of the traditional Mongolian hunt became a kind of symbol of Mongol identity within this very complex sort of politics of identity. There were some of the Mongol princes and other family members who had stayed up in the steppe or in some of the other khanates had remained more true to their ethnic identity. And so there was this constant struggle of trying to kind of appease them and also rule this huge and prosperous Chinese empire from which they were drawing much of their wealth. And so there's sort of this play. And here we see Kublai Khan right here on his horse. And who do you suppose this is? Chabi, yes, there he is, okay? She is, right? And then surrounded by falconers, and here we'll see a detail here. This one has his falcon, and they would hunt using falcons. Okay, so the bureaucracy of China under the Yuan was divided into, the bureaucracy in general, the Mongols preferred to rule through consensus. So they had to have long meetings where people would talk about things and come to agreement about what they should do. And then in China, however, they tried to keep the original Chinese bureaucracy intact. So there were sort of these two systems that were both in place at the same time. Creating a fair amount of redundancy. Another aspect of the Yuan government throughout China was that the civil service examinations that had been so much a part of the Chinese system of recruitment into the government were canceled. They were reinstated in 1315 for a few years and then canceled again. So what this meant was that if you were trying to get a government position, you had to rely on your connections. It was all about networking, who you knew, what people thought about you, and so there's a lot of positioning, okay? The other aspect of this bureaucracy is that there were preferential treatment given to different categories of people. And on the study guide, I've put this system, this fourfold system. So Mongols were at the top. They were called guoren, or national people. And some of the early groups in the vicinity of the Mongols were also considered guoren. So that was the top. So they had the highest priority for appointment. This is not to say that all Mongols who were living in China during this period were actually governmental workers at the highest rank. There were actually communities of Mongols who were brought to China to serve as farmers. So they would open, and so there were also other Mongols of differing social status. But as you all know, most of the material culture and the visual culture of China comes from the elite, so we're usually going to be talking about the elite groups. So the second second rank were people who were non-Chinese, and they were called Sumuren, or colored eyes, and they were from those vast territories out in Central Asia, through Persia, all, Arabs, all of those people were considered the second category of, you might call them foreigners, but had preferential status. The third group were called Hanren, the Han of Korea. These were northern Chinese and Koreans who had joined the Mongol polity relatively early. And then the last group were the Nanren, or southern Chinese, and they had the lowest rank. So many of these men who were part of the literate elite of the Song Dynasty, and then their sons and grandsons, really had a difficult time getting a position that would support their family, that would allow them to move forward. And in fact, the Yuan bureaucracy was filled with Chinese men from the north and from the south who were essentially clerks, okay, sort of lower functionaries rather than serving at the very top. And this is one of the things that makes Zhao Mengfu, who we'll be talking about a little bit more, so interesting. So I just brought this. This again is from the Asian Art Museum. It's an epitaph, or a posthumous. It's dedicated to this retired scholar Zhi Tang. It's an essay that basically talks about his life, who he was, and so forth. And it's done by a southern Chinese from, I believe he was from the region around Hangzhou. And he actually ended up going to serve the Mongols and was in the capital at Dadu for a little while. But one of the things that these southern gentlemen did during the Yuan was use their skills as literati in order to promote themselves. So, for instance, during the Yuan, we see a huge rise in family genealogies and histories of one's families, a huge rise in the commissioning of famous scholars to write your epitaph. So it wasn't that Yang Weizhen just said, okay, here's my friend, I'm going to write something for it. It would be his son or grandson, this retired scholar, Zhi Ting, who would come to Yang Weizhen and basically pay him. This is a matter of how you survive, to write the father's epitaph, to write an essay about the things that the father had done. And then this became part of the promotion of individual families. Okay, so increasingly we see this culture of these educated elites in China trying to position themselves within this non-exam system. And we see them making good friends with Mongols and foreigners who are in their midst and who are ruling them. because they realize the only way that they are not going to sink into utter poverty is to make amends. So although in the first part of the dynasty we might see these in the south of China, we might see resistance to the Mongols, it was only about a decade before we begin seeing a reconciliation, an acknowledgement that there were ways in which being part of the system was helpful. And even those who refused to serve in the government were often interested in getting their sons a position because that was the future of their family. So the traditional story that all of the Chinese hated the Mongols, you have to moderate it a little bit. Okay, so let's move forward. The cloth of gold. Perhaps I should have had this slide earlier. All of these workmen brought to the center so that they could work these incredible fabrics of gold thread. And here you see one that's in the was in the exhibition. And you can recognize, you're familiar with this broad scope of Asian art into Persian, Arab lands, and you can see this directly out of a different kind of visual vocabulary. And that's what we see in these textiles. Okay, so that's our overall view of some aspects of the Yuan dynasty. And now I want to start talking a little bit more pointedly about patronage. And I bring you two examples here of two objects, and want to just consider the situations in which these were made, okay? So on the right, we have ewer. It's Qingbai, which is a southern ware. It was made in primarily in Jingdezhen in the south, in Jiangsu province. And it's almost 10 inches tall. And it's an unusual visual object. If you think back to your Song ceramics, okay? This is from 1313, so not too long after the fall of the Song. And the kinds of works that had been produced in these kilns in that area were these very elegant, the Song, your image of very elegant, clean curves, very simple, not too much embellishment. If there is embellishment, it's usually incised embellishment. Whereas here we have this rather strange form, okay? It looks like it's maybe derived from some kind of other material, non-ceramic material, because it has these bands and these bosses that seem to look like nails or some kind of attachment. And in fact, it comes out of Tibetan metalwork. And so, and then this form up here also comes out of Tibetan metalwork form. It's made in South China, in southern Chinese materials. It was found, okay, so you're already starting to see this. And these curly cues here, also very Yuanish, okay? Once you see them, you won't forget them. This was found in a tomb in near Beijing, in the tomb of a man named Tieke. That's in Chinese characters. This person was known as Tieke. But we know that actually he was a man who came from Kashmir in northern India, Kashmir. And he has this object in a pseudo-Tibetan style of Chinese material, made in southern China, brought to the north and buried in his tomb. His tomb is a Chinese-style tomb, sort of in keeping with those Chinese ideas of the ritual treatment of the deceased. And so what we're seeing here is a really complicated patronage system, okay? The favoring of unusual mixtures of visual vocabularies, technologies, and so forth being used by people from disparate parts of the empire. There was lots of intermarriage going on at this time as well, so it's quite possible that Tieke had a Chinese wife. So there are lots of different interesting issues associated with this and its patronage context. On the left, I show you a painting from the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Beautiful painting. I think you will immediately recognize it as being something done in the literati style of Chinese painting, ink on paper, calligraphic treatment of the brush, simple subject matter that has a kind of poetic overtone, the idea of bamboo and rocks, elegant, upright, Confucian, gentleman, that kind of symbolism. A very simple composition. You would not mistake it for anything other than Chinese literati painting, probably of this period. It is a Yuan painting. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this guy. His name is Zhang Yanfu. Sounds Chinese enough, right? And Zhang was kind of a popular surname for the Mongols to adopt, and he was in fact a Guoren, a Mongol. He was a Taoist priest. He lived in a major temple in Dadu in Beijing. And he made this painting. It was dedicated to a man named Zhang Wen. It was made in 1343. Zhang Wen actually comes from the south, from Hangzhou, I believe. And he was well known in Chinese literary circles, both in the south and in the north. Zhang Yanfu, he also uses some seals, I think they're here, that it's a Xiyu, or the western regions. It was, western regions were sort of outside of China, so one of the personal seals that he used referred to his non-Chineseness. Up here, these are inscriptions written by friends and colleagues of Zhang Yanfu. This one is signed by a guy named Yahu. Yahu was an Ongut. This is a tribe in the northern part of Jin territory that the Mongols brought into their polity very early, and many of them were Nestorian Christians, so Yahu is actually a way of writing Jacob, okay? So you're starting to see this very complex kind of social dynamic. This was probably made in Dadu at the capital by Zhang Yanfu. But it brings all of these people together. It's in this literary style. And although we can't, did Zhang Wen pay him for this? Probably not. I don't know what kind of definition you're using for patronage. I use it more broadly to say the kind of circumstances in which something is made for somebody else, okay? Then that creates that moment of exchange. It's complicated, right? It's not straightforward at all. Okay, so patronage in the Yuan dynasty. We can very briefly say it's an outgrowth of this pluralistic and multi-ethnic society in many cases, not always, but there's a variety of kinds of things going on. It gives rise to hybrid styles in a variety of different media. And it's not exclusively dominated by the court, although we will see that the court plays an important role. And of course, the Mongol political situation brought all of these people together in the first place, so that certainly had a role to play. And it doesn't follow easy narratives, for better or for worse. It's always easy if you have a nice, clean story to tell without any loose ends or questions or I don't know quite, but maybes. That's nice, but actually it's a lot more fascinating when you have those loose ends, in my opinion. That's what That's what I like. Not easy, clean things. Things that show the messiness of human life and human history. Those are the things that are really fun. And so we'll see some of those. So you might hear me saying, I don't quite know the answer here, but so that's what I like. Okay, so I've divided it into 4 parts. We're going to look at something I've called local adaptations in new languages. This is about Chinese-style painting, literati painting, done in the south and in the north. So we'll be looking at 2 kinds of locations in which that kind of painting took place. In the south, in the old domain of China, that still had this very strong indigenous society, Confucian society. And then we'll also look at implications of that in the north, because as we just saw, that Zhang Yanfu was working in the north in this kind of southern literati style. Then we're going to look at some ceramics, and these 3 are, actually, all of these are from the collection here, okay? So these are from the collection. And talking about these blue and white wares that became so prevalent during this period, and also looking a little at the lacquer production during the Yuan dynasty. Then we'll look at imperial beliefs. The Mongols were the Mongol ruling family were great patrons of Tibetan Buddhism, and really paid a lot of attention to this and even paid a lot of money. Some of you may have read the article by Dr. Jing, in which he says that during Kublai's reign around 1280, they estimate that he was spending about as much on patronage to Tibetan temples as he was to his military. And that's a huge investment. So looking at how that imperial interest created new vocabularies, and we'll look at this. This was actually made in the south, in Suzhou. And then finally, the rise of a very dynamic popular culture during this period that gave rise to new motifs that we see in the ceramics at this time. Okay, so starting with local adaptations, new languages, northern and southern contexts. Okay, so this painting, people familiar with this painting? It's in the collection here. And you will see it's anonymous. It is a very typical Yuan dynasty landscape composition with foreground trees and these long shoals that extend out, a small, here you see it, a small hut, and then a long expanse of more or less blank silk, and then the distant mountains on the other side. Very typical of mid to late Yuan landscape composition style. And in fact, the great text about Chinese painting by James Cahill is called Hills Beyond the River, okay? It's exactly referencing this kind of composition. So textbook Chinese Yuan painting, landscape painting. It's titled Fisherman's Joy. It's ink with a little bit of color on silk, and it's quite large, almost 5 feet tall, so kind of monumental. And as I wrote down here, patronage context unknown. So what I want to do is untangle a little bit some of the things that we see here and try to understand in what kind of context this might have been produced. And I'll suggest a couple of different ways that we might understand this. Part of my interest in this comes from the website. The website here is fabulous. You have so many images available. It's really easy to search, and there are even labels there. But in that label, there's an emphasis on fishermen, and fishermen as a symbol of reclusion, of not serving in the government, and that this is tied to the Song in some ways, and into the idea of not participating with this new domain. the Mongol polity. Okay, and this is certainly one way to understand fishermen as a symbol during this period, but I don't think it's the only way to understand it. Okay, so we might say that it's a part of a southern tradition. So first I'm going to position it within a patronage context that would be in southern China, part of this new literati painting circle that's growing up in Wuxing, Hangzhou, Suzhou, this region. And I bring to you Zhao Mengfu, okay, the great, probably the greatest Chinese painter and calligrapher, I want to say of all time. Okay, I know I'm opening myself up, but really had a major role to play in the transition. And as I said, he was descended from the Song imperial family. He survived the transition. He went actually into hiding in his local, he was from Wuxing. His family lived in Wuxing. They had been given a very large hereditary estate there by one of the early Southern Song emperors, and he went into hiding. A lot of other members of the Song family did not have such good luck. There were huge massacres, wholesale massacres. A lot of the kinsmen actually lived in Fuzhou, in Quanzhou, and the Mongols just went in and decimated them. And those who were not massacred, many of them, there were mass suicides. I mean, huge numbers of the Zhao clan were just wiped out. So his survival into the Yuan was, number one, already something to be quite proud of. He eventually, as I said, he went to work for Kublai. Kublai Khan sent some recruiters basically to the south looking for men that they had heard of, looking for names of respected scholars, of imperial kinsmen who had made a name for themselves, who might come and provide a kind of symbol for the Mongols at the center, but also might actually help with understanding the populations and the systems of rulership. And Zhao Mengfu is one of the people who actually accepted this. And he suffered a certain amount of grief, a fair amount of criticism for doing this. And I always feel that his comeback to that would have been, well, if not me, who else is going to do this? Somebody has to be a part of this new system. We can't go against them, so we might as well join them and make it better for everybody, okay? So if I'm a good Confucian there in the government providing good input to Kublai and to the other members of the inner circle, then that can actually help ameliorate the situation of my compatriots across China. He's one of the best-known calligraphers and painters of this period, and is largely credited with introducing a kind of a new style that emphasizes ink. We have color in here, but a lot of his are just simple ink. He uses these long calligraphic, wavy, what's often called a rope-like stroke, kind of blunt treatment of the trees, and a strange composition in which these mountains that are the subject are just these bizarre conical shape here and bread-like shape here, a ground plane that goes deep into the distance. So he's using something, a kind of, these brush strokes are taken out of the Northern Song Dynasty style of Dongyuan, so he's referencing ancient Chinese traditions in painting, introducing a new kind of primitivism, looking back with some nostalgia to the Chinese past, but also making it sort of up to date at the same time. You wouldn't not mistake this as, a copy for an earlier painting. This is a new updating of the Chinese tradition. So he's very influential. His calligraphy, he was also extremely sought after as a calligrapher. In fact, he and his family were often asked for 2 or 3 character inscriptions for making plaques on houses and buildings and all kinds of things. They were asked to write out sutras and other things that would be distributed. We don't know if they got money for doing that. I think probably not, but I think they got a reputation, they got a status, okay? And in the absence of the exams, status was important, okay? Showing your scholarly bona fides through this essential Chinese calligraphic tradition, that was important. Zhao Mengfu was so well known as a calligrapher during this period that most of the publishers started to print their books in a new font that was called the Zhao font. Yeah, so there's an article in this somewhere. It's fascinating, going to be a great article. You know, the use of this Song imperial scions calligraphic style in a major way in the publishing industry in the Song. Okay, so let's get back to this painting. The patronage context. It was painted for a friend of his father and his uncle who was named Zhou Mi, and I actually wrote my dissertation on Zhou Mi, so fond of him. He was an official under the Song who refused to serve under the Yuan, and so he's a Chinese very high elite. And he received this ostensibly as a gift. So Zhao Mengfu painted it for him. It's of a scene in northern China where Zhao Mengfu had been posted in the service of the Yuan. And it just happens to be the ancestral home or region of Zhou Mi, okay, whose family had been in the south for so many generations, they had never seen this place. So, trying to understand this. Partially, I feel like Zhao Mengfu, I mean, it's a gift, and we know literati gave paintings as gifts. But I also feel like Zhao Mengfu is, in some ways, presenting himself through this gift as somebody who has gone to the north, who stays true to Chinese traditions, but is moving forward with them. He's showing his friend a place that he can't visit. So it's complex, okay? And I would say this gift giving in the Yuan was very much a kind of patronage context. Not, you know, sometimes between close friends who are having a glass of wine together, dashed off something and, you know, added an inscription, and, you know, it was a record of that social event. But there were also a lot of literate men who used their paintings as gifts to important people. And so when you're trying to develop a network, when you're trying to make some guanxi here and there, okay, giving gifts is important. And giving gifts that show a certain kind of erudition or a certain kind of elegance, a certain kind of personal taste, moral virtue, whatever it is that's being communicated through your painting and your calligraphy. And we know that those are very important in literary traditions in China, right? So that kind of gift giving was important. There were artists who made works in literati style who weren't really literati, but their paintings would be bought and then used as gifts in the same kind of gift-giving network in the absence of exams. I mean, even with exams, there was that kind of thing. But I see it as exaggerated during the Yuan because of that lack of exams. Okay, so I've talked at length about this. Here's our painting from the Asian Art Museum again. And to position it within this, you can start to see some of these traditions of that long, open space that is ushered in here, and this horizontal and so forth and so on. But if you position it in the southern context, here is Wu Zhen, who works in this very clumsy style, seems to have never sold a painting in his life, was very poor, desperate, and his neighbor Sheng Mo, who was one of these what we might call a professional painter, if we're using that old language, and sold his paintings that were then used as gifts, okay? So here we have this kind of, we could position it here. Maybe it's on the side of Wu Zhen, somebody who's living in reclusion and painting local scenery. Maybe it's over here too, okay? And I understand that there's usually a break about now. So why don't we take our break? We'll come back and finish up this section, and then I'll talk about the other three things.